The relationship between the US and China has always been characterized by mistrust. The world's two largest economies view each other as rivals, and their latest dispute was ignited by a white balloon that China flew over US territory. The US government says that its Air Force shot down a spy balloon that American media describes as part of a global Chinese surveillance system. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken postponed his trip to China. What's at stake for Washington and Beijing, and why? On To The Point, we ask US-China rivalry. What's behind the growing tensions? Welcome to this week's To The Point. I'm Javier Arguedas. It's good to have you with us. Let's now meet today's guests. Marina Henke, Professor of International Relations at the Hertie School. Qian Sun, a freelance journalist based here in Berlin, working for several Chinese and German media outlets. And Thorsten Benner, Director of the Global Public Policy Institute, GPPI. To all three of you, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. And of course, we have to start talking about this very visual, very iconic balloon. We've seen it everywhere. It has been mocked. And China certainly has tried to play it down and to certainly act as if this was not really that big a deal. So I'd like to start with you, Qian. How big a deal is it really?
I think it's hard to really see through this black box of Chinese leaders. So I think one way to look at it is really to look at what's the official narrative that China really try to display in the public sphere. And when we look at what's the discussion that the Chinese government is trying to facilitate, there's a lot of memes about this balloon, seemingly interesting icon that flew over U.S. territory, and how Chinese netizens are really making fun of it. I think it's the indication that Chinese narratives is really trying to make it almost comical in a way, and that's a downplay. I think that sends a lot of signals that Chinese government really like people to look at it as an incident rather than a major happening.
That's certainly what they're trying to do. Marina, if we take a look at this, China claims the balloon is just for research purposes. However, it did fly over very strategic U.S. military bases, even storing nuclear weapons. From your perspective, how much of a threat is this alleged spy balloon for the U.S. security?
Well, you know, in itself, it's not such a big threat. China is collecting intelligence, and it uses this balloon to get clearer pictures, to be able to hover over military sites, to get sensitive data. And, you know, the balloon has certain advantages over satellites. But I think it still says a lot about the state of Chinese-American relations, because the reaction inside of the United States was very harsh. The public very much is, you know, extremely critical of China. I think we really have reached new heights in anti-China sentiment in the United States. And then, of course, you know, one can ask, why now? Why was the balloon sent over the United States? Was there an intention from the Chinese part, or was this just pure happenstance? And then, of course, you know, like, how does the story now unfold? The Chinese, you know, do not necessarily take the position of saying that's true, we are collecting surveillance. They're still pretending that this is a weather balloon. And, you know, we will also see how it plays out internally, and how, you know, will it reinforce the position of the hardliners inside of China, or will it actually maybe soften the stance a little bit and then lead to military talks between the United States and China, which have been stopped since Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year?
We'll definitely talk about that later on. It's very important that it seems like it's not even the incident, but how it is going to be used. Now, this is not the only balloon that we saw, Thorsten. We also saw another balloon that was flown over Latin American territory, even leading to an apology from the Chinese government. From a country that says that it only wants stability and not delve into political disputes, how do you think these two balloons have actually changed the perception, or could change the perception of China as a world player?
I think nobody had any illusions about the designs of the Chinese Communist Party and its leadership. It is not exactly shocking that They use every available technology, and balloons is a technology that the US literally didn't have on the radar, and now, piecing together the information on these Chinese activities. But as such, that's not really a surprise. China threatens Taiwan. China builds artificial islands against international law in the South China Sea, and China spies globally, uses satellites, does cyber hacking to get sensitive data of prominent Americans and so on. So that's not really news. As Marina said, the real story is, how does this incident play politically? And it tells us it's really hard to put a floor under the relationship between the US and China, because distrust on both sides is rampant. Plus, there's a lot of pressure domestically in the US for a president to be really tough on China. The same way there's a lot of pressure on the Chinese leadership to be tough on the US. Imagine in the coming weeks, maybe the new House Majority Leader McCarthy will travel to Taiwan. Xi Jinping will be under pressure to be even more aggressive in his reaction than he was last year when Nancy Pelosi went.
We will see. Yeah.
If I just may chime in, I think it was a little bit of a surprise for Latin America. A lot of Latin American countries, in particular South American countries, are actually quite sympathetic toward China. I'm looking at Brazil, but also Argentina, and that they are now also part of this spying program. I don't think it's necessarily going to drastically change the relationship, because they massively benefit economically from China. But at least, it might at least kind of pause the very pro-China discourse that exists in these countries.
Or at least send an alarm. However, on this table, it seems like no one really doubts it was a spy balloon. However, we know that each part is trying to sell it in a different way. Was it a clear case of espionage or just an innocent weather balloon? The Chinese government says it was a civilian device that accidentally flew into US airspace, but Washington sees far darker intentions.
American fighter jets shot down a spy balloon, dashing hopes of a peaceful reconciliation between China and the US. For now. The case is clear-cut to the US administration, espionage, but questions remain. Why use a balloon? Some experts see it as an obsolete tool to spy, while others are calling balloons a useful surveillance vehicle. China is said to have repeatedly spied on US military installations in the past with this method. Balloons fly much lower and are therefore difficult for radars to detect, giving them an advantage over satellite surveillance. This means they can remain undetected in one place for a long time, allowing them to spy on suitable military assets or missile tests. Satellites can only do so during flybys from high altitudes. These kinds of balloons are also capable of intercepting enemy communications. Will the balloon shooting cause Sino-American relations to deteriorate even further?
That's, of course, the big question, Thorsten. We had already mentioned that Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, wanted to travel to China. He now postponed that trip. What kind of signal does that send about where the U.S.-China relations are right now after this incident?
Since the signal is really hard to stabilize them. The two presidents tried so in Bali at their meeting, and Blinken's visit, where he was supposed to also be received by Xi Jinping himself, which was a sign, this is an important visit, and we take this seriously, and we want to invest in putting a floor under our relationship. Right now, it demonstrates this is very hard to do. Hopefully, Blinken will be able to travel to Beijing in the coming weeks before this potential visit of the House Majority Leader McCarthy to Taiwan happens, because I think these communication channels are really essential. For a long time, the Chinese side was skeptical about investing in these back channels and constructive channels of communication. And I think if Beijing now signals they want this visit to go ahead, I think Biden would be well advised to send his Secretary of State.
And Joe Biden certainly also tried to play this down, saying that it did not really take a hit, like the relations between the U.S. and China did not take a hit from the balloon incident. Qian, what do you make of that, especially from what you're hearing from the Chinese side? Is this a game changer in any way?
I think if you only look at it from the Chinese social media and reporting, it doesn't seem to be a big deal. But it's definitely very, very symbolic in many ways. I think this balloon, when you look far away, it looked like exactly like a ping-pong ball. So if you would take this as a symbol as well, in the 1970s, that's exactly the ping-pong diplomacy that established the Chinese and American relationship. That was a small ball and then kind of pushed this diplomatic ball, like rolling over. And right now, a balloon, kind of this very image that in the blue sky, as Maria has mentioned, that it's not, if you compare with, for example, a way advanced cyber attacks and other spying technologies, this is a very small thing, but it's very big in terms of how unstable the relationship is. I think we do need these communication channels in order to avoid a small case would derail the bilateral relationship. And ironically, that's exactly what happened. A balloon showed up and then derailed this really important for both sides visit.
Yeah, any small detail can make things far, far worse. Now, Marina, you already mentioned the anti-China sentiment in the United States. Of course, this is quite visual, and the Republican Party specifically is using it. Do you think they are succeeding in actually driving public opinion against having a better relationship with China?
So the Sino-US rivalry didn't start yesterday, right? So people date the pivot to Asia to the Obama administration, but when you look closely at Pentagon papers in particular, it actually already started in the mid-2000s. This is when the Pentagon and military planners for the first time declared China as the peer competitor, as the real military rival of the United States, as the one country that, you know, could really compete and also undermine the US and the global liberal world order. And ever since, in the beginning, it's right, it was kind of a Republican position, but now I would say that the Democratic Party is as hawkish on China as the Republicans. And actually, it's one of the very few topics that in very polarized America still unites this country. It's their position on China. And just like an absolute conviction that with especially China under Xi Jinping, so a very authoritarian China, the United States cannot cooperate.
And they are certainly trying to have a sort of a competition, both parties, to see who is harsher on China. Torsten, what do you make of what you've seen so far in the discourse after this incident and the pressure that Joe Biden felt in order to react?
And Joe Biden pursued a very smart China policy because he was really tough economically, technologically, while at the same time tougher than the Trump administration on some counts, while at the same time rallying allies to America's side. That was seen as pretty effective and threatening by Beijing, especially the technology sanctions on semiconductors that were announced late last year. And so in the US, the Republicans, of course, cannot say, oh, President Biden is actually tougher on China than Trump and smarter because he actually works with allies. They need to use this balloon incident to say he was very soft on China because he didn't shoot down the balloon while it was kind of over our it was over our land space, and only did so when it was over water, and he's weak on China. And as we move into campaign mode in the US, I fear that this kind of competition, who's tougher on China with stupid proposals also, will dominate the airwaves. This balloon was made for American cable TV. You had days of stupidity in terms of public commentary on this, and I think it gives us a preview of what is to come in campaign season.
If I May
Sure,
I add? I think it's also one of the narrative is that this kind of discussion slightly blown out of proportion is exactly because the rivalry is within the American parties, because the Republicans are trying to blame the Democrats that are too soft on China, but then the Democrats is also trying to say that actually it didn't just happen in Biden's administration, it happened in Trump's administration as well. And exactly, I think the National Security Advisor Sullivan has said, because the Biden administration improved the detective technology, that's why it happened. So I think the other sort of narrative and some advice would be on this situation, or some other advisors said that right now, really, America needs diplomatic wisdom to mellow it down, to make sure that maybe potentially this trip can still happen.
It is a difficult balance between trying to stay tough on China and, on the other hand, pursue a better relationship with the rival, with the competing power. Now, President Biden certainly tried to be crystal clear.
I'm committed to work with China where we can advance American interests and benefit the world, but make no mistake about it. As we made clear last week, if China threatens our sovereignty, we will act to protect our country, and we did.
Well, that's what the U.S. is saying. Of course, we have to look at China as a rival, as we've already mentioned. Marina, how big a threat do you think are we talking about right here for the United States?
So Xi Jinping is an authoritarian leader, and he has a very precise agenda. And he has stated this agenda on various occasions in speeches. And it is the Chinese dream, and this Chinese dream includes that it wants China to become the #1 in technology globally, but also it wants, quote unquote, that China rejuvenates. He always uses what it's in English translated into rejuvenation. What does this rejuvenation entail? It is that Taiwan becomes again part of China. It is part and parcel of Xi Jinping's agenda, of his strategy, and he wants to reach this by 2049. Why 2049? Because it's the 100th anniversary of the founding of China, of communist China. And so I think this plan is real, and we have to take it seriously, but the question is, how will this reunification with Taiwan unfold? I think there's a lot of, pressure from China to do it, quote unquote, politically, peacefully, a lot of cyber attacks to kind of infiltrate the Taiwanese system and try to, make them believe that there's no other options than to reunite with China. But, it also looks likely that they won't succeed, especially the youth in Taiwan is becoming more and more anti-Chinese and wants to stay independent. It looks at Hong Kong in particular and sees we cannot end up like them. And so a military invasion of Taiwan looks more and more likely, but the Chinese are also aware that this is an incredibly tough endeavor. China, is a military power, but it doesn't have a lot of military experience. And Taiwan is an island, and invading an island is incredibly hard. And then, of course, there's still the U.S. factor. Will the U.S. defend Taiwan, or will they help Taiwan? And will this then escalate in a real Pacific war? So I think, there are a lot of variables still on the table, but it's clear that Xi Jinping wants Taiwan to be back in Chinese fold. And I wouldn't doubt that intention, no point.
He makes it very clear. However, there are very many variables, as you mentioned, and also very dubious or confusing discourses, even in China, when it comes to the use of force, Qian. It is always mentioned, but it is always mentioned that they don't want to do it.
I think, as we all know, that it's hard to get sort of opinion polls, for example, in Chinese public, how much people are actually supporting to take over Taiwan by force and how much not. But look at the sentiments from people, and I think it's similar, a bit like Russia. When something internally happens, and Taiwan is always a very good excuse to unite, sort of on a national level. And I think one article recently published is quite interesting, is the Chinese ambassador in France. So he did a show on France TV station, and then people ask about this blue incident as well, and then, of course, referring to whether or not taking Taiwan by force. He didn't say it specifically with specific words, we will do it, but he did say, if we cannot do it by peace and every other possible options are still on the table. And he also addressed that, yes, we want Taiwan back. So I think, as Marina said, this is a clear signal that it could happen one day. But I think Biden actually did say as well, specifically when Taiwan needs help, U.S. will be military involved.
And that's one of the reasons why some military experts in the United States think that a military confrontation between China and the U.S. could happen in the coming years, Thorsten, isn't it?
Yeah, but it doesn't help us to speculate when it will happen. I think nobody can say with certainty. The deputy defense minister of the U.S., Colin Kahl, recently said that U.S. military superiority in critical domains would still prevent China from moving in the coming years, most likely. But I think we really need to get our language straight. It's not a reunification. Taiwan was never part of the People's Republic of China. It would be a takeover of Taiwan. It would be the ultimate victory of the Communist Party in the civil war that it fought with the KMT, and would kind of achieve that goal. At the same time, the question is what to do about this. I think the real challenge is to prevent this new Cold War between the US, its allies, and China and Russia from turning into a hot war over Taiwan. And what we need is effective deterrence. That means not only military capabilities for Taiwan to defend itself, but also a clear commitment of Europe, of Germany, to say, Xi Jinping, you need to decide. Do you want to be technology and economic leader and do business with us, or do you want to take over Taiwan? You can't do both. And if you move on Taiwan, you upset the peaceful status quo, then you will face sanctions the same way Putin is facing them. So to make the choice very clear to the Chinese side.
And that choice also implies the way commerce works. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine clearly outlined the risks of relying on just one provider of goods and services. In the aftermath of both crises, the U.S. is trying to become less dependent on China. For some, it's an almost impossible task.
Build back better. That was U.S. President Joe Biden's promise recently at the opening of Taiwanese chipmaker TSMC's new semiconductor chip plant in Arizona. But there was another important message: keep China out. Especially from key tech manufacturers like this one. Conduct business with friendly countries only. Friendshoring is now the latest buzzword. The result? Chinese corporations like Huawei are losing orders in the USA. Now, instead of selling cell phones to America, the company is focusing on increasing automation in China. The disconnect between the two economies is progressing at a rapid speed. The US military is also becoming more confrontational. To deter China's aggressive posturing in the South China Sea toward Taiwan, the US is demonstrating solidarity with neighboring democratic countries like Japan. And more recently, the Philippines. What's next in this economic, technological, and militaristic showdown?
What's next, and will it work? Marina, do you think this strategy works, trying to prevent China from getting key technologies and working closer with the allies?
Well, I think there's a good chance that at least it will impede the progress. But, you know, first, all the American allies need to implement it. And to a certain degree, Germany has great difficulty implementing it. A lot of German businesses are still heavily investing in China, and I fully agree with Thorsten here. There needs to be a clear decision made in the heads and also a clear word spoken from the German administration that, you know, if you want to move on Taiwan, you can no longer count on us.
But does it really make sense for the European countries to get involved in this dispute, especially commercially speaking, if they're so reliant on us?
I think it's in our interest that we don't supply the Chinese leadership with the technology that enables its military rise. And China has a clear strategy of civil military fusion. A lot of the critical technologies are used for the buildup of the militaries. And do we want to sit here in 5, 10, whenever years and then lament that we actually enabled the technologies that allowed China to move militarily? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. And it's not easy to answer because it does come with significant economic costs.
Costs that are also there for China. Very briefly, how do you see the outlook in that sense?
I think when dealing with China, also people need to separate a bit what is Chinese government and what is Chinese people. And we can go back to the protests that happened not long ago. This happened exactly because there's a bridge. And how do we keep this bridge on top of the sort of complicated situation? I think it's also very important.
We'll see if those bridges continue. That's all we have time for in this week's To The Point. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Take care.